As I was working, thinking about my remarks for you today, I remembered that it's the 4th of July. It's actually impossible, I think, for any American not to think about independence on the 4th of July. We are literally trained to do so from our earliest understandings of ourselves and our place in society. And in the tumultuous wake of the events over the last 10 days, it has become impossible, too, not to think about independence in more compromised and less triumphalist terms than I have been accustomed to. An independence that suddenly puts the collective at risk. And certainly in America, we have continued on the national level to struggle to balance independence with the collective good. Declarations of independence with admissions of interdependence. The future of the humanities, in my view, needs to intervene in this question. And the way that it needs to do this is by creating a more public humanities. I think that we need public humanities for profoundly political reasons, because they enable democracy, the rule of law, individual authority rather than state or divine authority. It is, of course, no accident and no news to anyone here that the Enlightenment period of the long 18th century saw the rise of the political revolutions in the West, first in England, then America, then France. As it happens, I actually was in New York last week, and on the night of the referendum, I was watching Hamilton the musical, which was a really strange convergence of ideas about independence and revolution. The overthrowing of monarchical and feudal regimes and the establishment of parliamentary and democratic political systems created all kinds of structural changes, again, which we're all familiar with. But in my view, one of the ones that doesn't get enough attention is the very foundational one, that they ensured that education is also political, as certainly Rousseau understood. Émile's sentimental education is, by definition, a political education. It relates in profound and foundational ways to issues of power, social relations, law, public life, to civil authority, the histories and structure of government, the political process itself. And all of these vital practices are transmitted and understood not through science, technology, engineering, or maths, the so-called STEM subjects, but through the humanities. Today we find ourselves living among a great many people who seem to think that we can cherry pick among these cultural ideas, that we can have some and not others. A little bit like the 4 freedoms. How many of the freedoms can you have? People who want the economic benefit that democracy, secularism, tolerance, and capitalism confer, but wish to perpetuate other forms of autocratic authority, patriarchy, religious fundamentalism, and arid empiricism or instrumental materialism that fears and rejects the creative and imaginative, not only because it may not provide economic security, but because it almost certainly will provide imaginative liberation from what Kant called nonage, or immaturity, the need to look to external authorities to do our thinking for us. But you can't have one without the other, because they are all systems founded upon basic principles of individual authority, equality, and autonomy. None of these concepts can survive in a society that doesn't recognize the citizen as sovereign individual rather than the subject of an individual sovereign. And again, we've all been thinking about sovereignty a lot more over the last 10 days than we are perhaps accustomed to. As Ian Watt famously showed in The Rise of the Novel, economic individualism and technological advances paved the way for the reading practices that would result in the novel. But the novel also communicated and extended new ways of imagining the individual's relation to society, particularly focused in the novel's early phase on the question of social mobility. The novel reflected social mobility, but literacy and imaginative identification and aspiration also helped advance social mobility. None of these ideas bound up in economic individualism can successfully be extricated from the humanities that support them. Our foundational value systems are embedded in the humanities. And therefore, the future of the humanities must, in my view, be founded upon a notion of public humanities that restores the concept of citizenship to the heart of the political conversation. I was at a conference last year at which I suggested that notions of citizenship ought to be rekindled and re-energized. And an academic complained, I thought somewhat cynically, that citizenship is, and I quote, a thin concept. It was said with great disdain. Citizenship, that's a very thin concept. I was taken aback. but I like to think that I come out fighting, and I responded that it may well be a thin concept, but it's a hell of a lot thicker than the consumer, which at the moment comprises the sum total of our current conception of the individual's relationship to the social and the political. The arid space of the market produces a desiccated concept of individuality, turning us all into straw men to be thrown on the bonfire of politicians' vanities. And again, we have seen some classic examples of that over the last few days. I don't know if you all caught up with the news over lunch, but Farage has just resigned. Yeah, he may or may not unresign, but he has resigned at present. And Douglas Carswell, speaking of public humanities and public discourse and citizenship, Douglas Carswell responded with a tweet that was a single emoji, which was the smiley face with sunglasses on. So that's our political discourse at present. Speaking of citizenship would at least restore an account of social responsibility, of political engagement, of the common good, and indeed the greater good to the conversation. And the humanity, and again, it's not that it would necessarily answer that question, but it would just allow us to start raising the question again. And I think that's been one of the problems with the way that the humanities have wanted to present themselves, is that we assume that we're the answer to the question as well. To say, well, the humanities will promote tolerance, the humanities will promote greater values. Well, not necessarily, and I'll come back to that at the end of my talk, but they have to be framing the questions for us. The humanities provides our foundation for and our hermeneutic into concepts of citizenship, individuality, consciousness, aspiration, heritage, conservation, sustainability, the common good, all of the conversations that we're having in political and social discourse. Over the last few years, we have all become accustomed, I think, to acknowledging that this is a challenging time for the humanities. Over the last 10 days, it's become a challenging time for everyone. But I persist in thinking that we need the humanities to address precisely these challenges. And I believe that it is partly because the humanities have been marginalized in our public discourse that we have found ourselves in the mess that we're in. I do also believe, however, that in times of challenge, it is possible to find opportunities. The humanities, in my view, have not mounted nearly a robust enough challenge to neoliberal systems and assertions of value. Not that they have many assertions of value. Their moral calculus is decidedly wanting. Mostly, in my experience, those neoliberal metric systems assert metric systems as if they substitute for values, as if they can actually be a value system. When universities were reductively reconstrued as institutions that pursued research with directly measurable economic benefits, these economic drivers did, as we all know, systematically exclude arts and humanities research outcomes. The scientific set of criteria by which we were measured set the humanities up for failure. We were measured in terms of the sciences and found wanting, putting us at a structural and systemic disadvantage. We know all of this, and I acknowledge it. We can all proffer examples in which pursuing economic benefits alone has created social catastrophes. An often cited instance is the profit that pharmaceutical companies made from HIV drugs, building on knowledge generated by public funding while keeping their drugs unaffordable in the very communities that needed them most, notably sub-Saharan Africa. But we could add the war profiteering in Iraq, the way that the Brexit debate has been manipulated by oligarchs seeking greater economic freedom. We can all cite myriad examples of the dangers of conflating market value with public good. And yet, in my view, the humanities have been too reactive in asserting the central role the humanities should play in resolving the grave challenges we face. We need to be proactive in making that case. And I do think that we need to recognize our partial complicity in our own marginalization. For decades, humanities research has taken place behind closed doors, and it has been published and circulated there too. The reasons for this are myriad, even overdetermined. And yet one of the easiest things we could do to restore our centrality to public discourse would be to begin to insist upon and recognize the ways that our own practices have contributed to this marginalization, even if they are by no means solely to blame for it. Many of us are understandably frustrated by constant demands that we demonstrate the relevance of our research and methods in ways that can be recognized by these neoliberal metrics. But we cannot let that impel us into the perversity of insisting upon our right to be irrelevant. We need a transformed political discourse. We all see the urgency of that in the midst of the consequences of the so-called post-fact politics that seem to have suddenly descended upon us, but are in fact the inevitable result of consumer politics and infotainment. We were all edified, I'm sure, by the assertion made by a former journalist and minister of education that the nation was tired of experts. Let's see where that got us. Experts are being sidelined, to be sure. But it is also the case that many experts in the humanities long ago abandoned the field. We must return to the fray, and our technical, arcane, exclusionary specialist languages are simply not going to get the job done. Advanced discussions are sometimes enabled by those languages. That is indisputable. But at what cost? At the cost of marginalizing an entire field of human endeavor and withdrawing humanities from the public sphere. There has also been a dangerous conflation between the arcane language of specialist research and topics, research topics that are perceived as arcane. And in my view, not only has society at large, the public conversation, conflated those two things, but I think too many researchers have accepted that conflation as well, so that people, in defending their right to research topics that are perceived as esoteric, also are simultaneously defending their right to produce research about those topics in esoteric language. And I think we need to tease the two out. We must defend those topics that are perceived as arcane and niche, because they contribute to the range, quality, and durability of our disciplines. We must make the case far more robustly for why research that seems to be arcane matters to society at large. And I think we have to do that in language that is not arcane. We must think creatively about what that value is. We cannot hold those truths to be self-evident because they simply aren't to too many people. We must be inventive and resourceful in mustering our arguments, in making our case. I have long held that the impact agenda offers us a Trojan horse, and I gather from Eleonora Belfiore's title that she may have made a similar argument. I'm sorry that I missed it, but I'd like to hear more about it in questions. I do think it's a Trojan horse, and I think it gives us the chance to use the tools we can find, and well, I think we should always use the tools we can find, but this is a potentially powerful one. Not because it gives them the metrics they always want, but because it creates an opportunity for us to make our case as widely as possible. And it does so by incentivizing the institution to make the time and space for individual researchers to proselytize what we do. At the moment, it does so in narrowly construed and reductionist terms, surprise, surprise, but we can still use it to demonstrate our relevance and the contributions we might make toward resolving these very familiar social challenges. But that argument is not the same as defending arcane language. And in my opinion, that language is doing more harm than good. Conceptual plurality is central to the vigor of humanities research. We all know that. It's a tenet of our field. Surely linguistic and idiomatic plurality should be as well. We can use digital transformations in social media to translate these so-called niche topics for wider audiences, for example, but we can also take topics that are not niche and talk about them in a much more rigorous, much more informed way. We should also, I think, champion a far wider and more creative array of methodological pluralities. We do need to maintain traditional standards of scholarly excellence: originality, scrupulosity, nuance, empiricism, and evidence-based thinking, ferociously returning facts to our socio-political discourse. I mean, evidence-based thinking probably should have gone first, second, third, fourth, and last. But we need not support the other orthodoxies, the other academic orthodoxies that tend to accompany them. We might embrace, for example, methodologies beyond argumentation, which is something I've spoken about before. We might return narrative to scholarship. There is a reason why history is far and away the discipline most likely to find wider audiences. And I don't think it is just that there is a public appetite for history. There is a public appetite for narrative. And there is a public appetite for literature and for art history, but there is no discernible public appetite for literary criticism as it is practiced in the academy today. And I say that as a literary critic. I'm looking at Simon, who heard my job talk in the late 1990s. Believe me, that was high theory at its worst. History legitimates narrative as one of its appropriate methodologies. But literary studies, film studies, philosophy, political science, a great many of the social sciences eschew narrative as somehow intellectually inadequate. Now, I'm not suggesting we replace analysis with narrative, but as history shows, I don't mean history shows, as historians show in their research, the two can creatively coexist, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be learning from the methodological successes of our cognate disciplines and exploring, as I say, methodological plurality, particularly in literary criticism. There's such a rigid orthodoxy that it must be argumentation. That is all you can do, and you can only do it in this language. And I think not only is that wrong, but it's self-defeating. And this is just one example of many. It's just one that is particularly dear to my heart. Value, it has been said, is revealed by use. The value of the humanities will only be recognized when we stop asserting it and start demonstrating it. We need a worldly humanities, a humanities that is in the world and of the world and is politically engaged. That does not mean that its intellectual agenda gets driven by politics. On the contrary, we can set our own intellectual agenda, which can and should include the stringent reminder that critical thought depends upon finding ways of thinking that resist, challenge, or transcend received modes of knowledge and institutional norms. Indeed, we need to continue insisting, many of us do, but we need to keep doing it, and we need to do it louder, on the value of thinking itself, beyond instrumentalist ideas about what constitutes a public good. At a talk last week, someone observed that one of the things the humanities does best is stimulate the imagination, which is a familiar enough thought until he extrapolated the observation that what the humanities does is not only stimulate the individual imagination, but the collective imagination. It reminds us of what is collectively possible, and it introduces new possibilities into that collective imagination. To be sure, we are constrained. We are constrained not only by the socio-political and economic realities of the neoliberal market culture that we inhabit, but also by the disciplinary structures within which we work, the institutional drivers and systems, the practicalities of peer review, promotion, and other issues of career advancement. That's for those of us who are fortunate enough to have more or less traditional academic positions. The so-called academic precariat, the ever-increasing numbers of casualized teachers and researchers, are further constrained by even more brutal realities like workload models, house prices, and paying the rent. I mean, we all are, but some of us are in more fortunate positions than others. One way of conceptualizing an approach going forward has recently been to think less in terms of disciplinary structures in framing our research questions, and rather using those disciplinary structures as the methods for answering the questions, and otherwise prioritize the questions and let the disciplinary methods follow, rather than the other way around. Many successful projects have begun focusing energies around solving the big challenges we face, using cross-disciplinary and cross-institutional collaboration to address grave geopolitical questions, climate change, conflict resolution, global poverty, but also large philosophical ones. What is the Good Life, for example, is a so-called Crossroads course being taught at the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard, which brings to bear not only traditional humanities approaches to answering the question of what constitutes the good life, but also medical researchers, engineers, lawyers, economists, throwing everyone at the problem. And of course, if you're at Harvard, you can afford to throw everyone at the problem, so that is another issue that we need to face. But as a model, I think it's an interesting one. Clearly, for example, this is also the approach being broadly taken by the Wellcome Trust. And in my view, it often produces very good things. It may be that the future of the humanities is increasingly extra-institutional. Certainly, universities to core need to begin making the same kinds of cases that I've been suggesting the humanities should be making, proactively asserting their value on their own terms, beyond metrics of employability. If they do so, we might have some faith in their ability to create the institutional spaces that will protect the future of the humanities. But if they don't, we need to find other ways to protect that future. I recently heard it formulated in a way I found helpful and that has stuck with me and that I want to continue to use. We're all accustomed to the divide and conquer mentality that says the humanities are at odds with the sciences. I'm sure I don't have to rehearse here that clearly we're on the same side. We're on the side of research. We're on the side of knowledge. We need to be working collaboratively. But that doesn't mean that we can all solve the same problems. And I've said this many times before, that it's a category error to suggest that STEM subjects can solve everything. STEM subjects can solve the things that STEM subjects can solve. They can cure cancer. Poetry cannot cure cancer. But the STEM subjects cannot solve the crisis in the Middle East. They cannot. It's a category error. It can't be done. And so we need to be able to articulate what the value is that the humanities brings to the conversation without accepting the us and them dichotomies that are adversarial and suggest that we're somehow opponents with the sciences, which, as I say, I'm sure none of us thinks that we are. And the way this was formulated I found really helpful because it was so simple and it seems to me right. Sciences answer the question of how, and sometimes of what. The humanities tell us why. You may not agree with that. I've been turning it over for a week, and it seems to me that it's fairly robust. This morning, the Wall Street Journal ran a very nice piece by a London-born, British passport-holding man of Indian and Pakistani heritage talking about getting his green card in America. He was granted it on the basis of his marriage to a lawyer from Tennessee, a lawyer who happens to be a man. That such marriage had only recently been acknowledged by the United States government contributed to the writer's sense of unease and distrust. He was certain he was going to be turned away. He was afraid he would get arrested for green card fraud, even though there was no fraud involved. And his husband, the lawyer, kept saying to him, but we're not committing fraud. And he kept saying, it was all interpolation. He was sure that he was criminalized in this conversation somehow, that he would be criminalized somehow. But he wasn't. His marriage was recognized according to the laws of the land, and his green card was granted, in a process he said he found transformative because it was based on the recognition of his fundamental humanity and his fundamental rights. This is how a country earns the love of its citizens, he wrote. It ennobles their relationships. It takes seriously their happiness. It acts on the assumption that people are basically good and, if given half a chance, will realize their better natures. Most of all, it creates the conditions, even here in this dreary government office, for them to do so. I read those words this morning as I was preparing to come here to talk to you today about the future of the humanities, and I couldn't help but feel that they described not only our hopes for democratic political systems, but also precisely what we value about the humanities. The humanities is not merely an umbrella term for a disparate group of research interests and disciplinary methods. It is also an article of faith, an implicit declaration every time we use the term that we are interested in humanity and that we believe our intellectual and ethical values promote and protect the best of humanity, encouraging tolerance, dialogue, historical understanding, critical thinking, and all of the intellectual practices that encourage us, at least most of the time, to be more humane. And we don't need to return to older arguments about the universal values of the humanities or about their transcendent benefits that are, speaking of evidence-based thinking, are clearly not holding water. That is not true. Obviously, studying the humanities doesn't make us better people ipso facto. In evidence of that argument, I will simply point out that all of our current so-called leaders are, in fact, humanities graduates. Osborne has a degree in modern history, which doesn't say a lot for what's being taught at modern history in Oxford these days. But meanwhile, Boris Johnson is making the classics look very bad indeed. And then there's the dread PPE. But we don't even need those cautionary examples to tell us this. Anybody who has spent any time in a humanities department can't sustain for long the argument that our subject makes us nicer people. It doesn't make us nicer people. But it does make us perpetual students. It makes us, to paraphrase Michael Berube, lifelong learners. It makes us open to challenging premises, to changing contexts. It makes us open to persuasion while maintaining very high standards about what it takes to persuade us. And that is what I think we need most of all. Thank you.